MK Ultra. Let's enter the buzzsaw.
Central Intelligence Agency.
It was described by witnesses as
Ron Patton is joining us today. He's a conspiracy researcher turned editor-in-chief of Paranoia magazine. He also executive produces Ground Zero with Clyde Lewis, the syndicated radio show. And he's joining us to talk about MK Ultra, Monarch, and other nefarious mind control programs. Ron, great to have you joining us finally.
Hey, thanks a lot, Sean. Glad to be on.
Yeah, we want to start by talking for the novices out there who don't quite know what MK Ultra means. Why don't you introduce us to that concept and what we know about MK Ultra?
Certainly. Well, MK Ultra was a behavior modification program started by both the CIA and Department of Defense, probably around 1947. And basically, we were trying to catch up with the Russians or the Soviets, who were also involved in what was called brainwashing or mind control. And so there were several projects that started out back in the late 40s, and eventually in the early 50s, these projects culminated into a big mind control program called MK Ultra. And essentially what they were trying to do is to create the perfect spy, a spy that wouldn't break under interrogation, that was multifaceted. And it probably went on for about 20, 25 years. However, the reality is, I believe aspects of it still go on today.
So now, where did you intersect with this research into MK Ultra? What brought you into it and incited, let's say, your foray down the rabbit hole?
It came about probably around 1992. I was living in Olympia, Washington at the time, and I went to hear this guy speak at a church. And he talked about being involved in this satanic cult. His family were involved, I guess they were multi-generational Satanists. And he also talked about, as a young child, being tortured, and to the extent where he had multiple personalities. And this basically occurred at a military installation, and he found out that it was at China Lake Naval Weapons Center. And it was like, okay. And, you know, basically my paradigm at the time was that our government wouldn't do these kind of things to children. You know, my dad was in the Navy, and so, you know, I had this persona that, you know, our government was basically good, and we just don't do these kind of things. So I listened to this guy, and he went on to talk about being in this Quonset hut, and within the Quonset hut was a cage. And the cage was divided. So on one part of the cage, you had these children, which he remembers as the expendable ones. And on the side of the cage that he was at, they were the chosen ones. And he was talking about the expendable ones being brutally tortured, raped, electroshocked, and mutilated and murdered. And I just had such a hard time believing that, you know, our government would do that, and I just thought he was crazy. And so after his talk, you know, I went up to him and I said, you know, where's the evidence to substantiate this? I mean, this is pretty horrific stuff. And so he did show me some information from the Freedom of Information Act, but still, it just didn't seem like enough evidence to, you know, really think that this stuff goes on. And, you know, and I told him, I go, if this in fact is true, why isn't it reported in the news? Why don't we see this stuff, you know, all over the place? And he goes, it's the biggest kept secret. This form of mind control is the biggest kept secret because, you know, the public would have such a difficult time believing it. And so that was basically the start.
So you went from there, from hearing this guy with a story that could have been completely created from whole cloth, to actually believing. Now, at what point did you start to realize that these types of mind control, because that's a different level of experimentation we're talking about. I mean, we know from history, we know MK Ultra, as far as documentation goes, there was CIA programs with experimenting with people without their knowledge, being doped, right, drugged, or whatnot. Even some psychological experiments involving electroshock and whatnot at mental hospitals. But
yes,
when it comes to the idea of children, at what point can we say definitively, yes, these programs occurred using children?
Well, if I can kind of continue on with that, he introduced me to this guy in Portland like a week later, because he said, "Hey, I'd like to introduce you to my friend Fritz Springmeier, and he has all kinds of information regarding this stuff." And I was extremely curious, and I was also skeptical too. So I went to meet with Fritz, and he was telling me all about this, Project Monarch mind control program, and I was fascinated, but it was starting to scare me a bit, because I started coming to the realization that this stuff may in fact be true. And so basically for about 3 years, I assisted Fritz with research and correspondence. But probably around 1995, I just realized he had a different agenda going on. And he was hanging out with these militia guys, and it was just a little too overwhelming for me. So I parted ways, and then I started doing my own research. And I hooked up with Joan d'Arc and Al Hidell with Paranoia magazine. And I put out an article called Project Monarch Nazi Mind Control in the fall issue of 1996.
And what were the basic conclusions that you had come to at that point?
Well, I realized that this stuff did in fact exist. However, with that said, I also realized that there was a disinformation campaign going on, and that basically out of the 149 sub-projects of MK Ultra, there was no official documentation of a Project Monarch. So again, the premise of Project Monarch had to do with the creation of multiple personality disorder starting as a child. And then what they do is they program each alter personality to do an assigned task or function. So let's say you might have one personality that's programmed to be a drug courier, and you have another personality that's a prostitute, and yet another personality that's a human tape recorder. So basically all these personalities are amnesic from one another, and the way they're accessed is through a trigger or a cue or a password. So that could be audible or visible. And even though it's so horrific, it's so ingenious as well, the way they were able to do this. Again, the government denies that, this stuff goes on or even happened, but there's so much evidence, there's so many testimonies, I believe a lot of credible ones. But again, getting back to the disinformation, I started coming to that realization that there was a lot of speculative stuff going out there that wasn't true. And so it was sort of a journey, because I think a lot of people just jumped on the bandwagon when the Monarch stuff came out back in the early 90s. And I believe Mark Phillips and Kathy O'Brien were the first, probably around 1990. And then that was followed up by Fritz Springmeier and Cisco Wheeler. But there were a lot of, it was problematic in a lot of the stuff they said, because it couldn't necessarily be verified or validated. And it seems like some of the stories that they were talking about were just so outlandish that it really, to me, I came to the conclusion that it just did a disservice to those real survivors of Project Monarch.
But again, you're calling it Project Monarch, but you're saying it probably was not called Monarch. Where did this term Monarch come from then?
Well, Mark Phillips is the one who started it, but I use the word monarch as sort of a way to describe this type of programming. So I guess I should preface that. Yeah, unfortunately, you know, again, we really can't track down exactly a name for this, but I believe there's like 3 or 4 sub-projects. If you put them together, it forms this Monarch stylized form of trauma-based mind control.
Mm-hmm. Now, are we seeing this leaked out into the general public? When we, for example, many people are pointing out music videos where they'll see the butterfly tattoo or the butterfly symbolism, or they'll see the sort of sex kitten symbolism, or various forms of expression of these various different personality types, even to the point of some performers having multiple personalities, or when Beyonce calls herself Sasha Fierce and says, I don't really identify with that person, it's almost as though something else takes over. Are we seeing this as perhaps these artists themselves have been traumatized or have somehow segued with the programs, or is it just sort of, do you think, a leakage of many of the symbols that are meant to disorient us and keep us confused?
I think it's both, actually. I think there are a few people in the entertainment industry that have gone through this type of mind control. There's a website called Vigilant Citizen that started to really analyze a lot of the music videos, and you know, talked about all this type of esoteric symbolism in regard to this Monarch stylized type of programming. But I think after a while it just started like taking off and had a whole life of its own. And again, some of the information just through cross-contamination or whatever, or embellishment, people will look at anything, oh look, there's a butterfly. You know, that person has a tattoo that has a butterfly, he must be programmed, or she must be programmed. So yeah, it's really difficult to say, but I think in part it's just also an aspect of social engineering. So whether it's really triggering people who are programmed, it's hard to say. But I also think there's an aspect on a macro scale that they're trying to program individuals, you know, through subliminals and esoteric and occult symbolism. So yeah, I think that goes on, but I just don't think it goes on as much as a lot of people think.
Well, you've obviously worked with Paranoia Magazine for about 20 years at this point, and I'm sure you've come across a lot of conspiracies. Do you think, going back to what that fellow said in the church, that this was the darkest conspiracy of all, this manipulation of children to try to create super spies? Do you think that is really the biggest thing you've come across?
I think so. And, you know, like I said, how it started out, you know, back in the early 90s, and everybody was sort of on the same page for a while. But again, I started realizing that there are a lot of sort of holes in different arguments regarding this. And yeah, it just seems like through the 90s and maybe like in the early 2000s, you started getting more validating testimonies through survivors. And a couple that I can mention are Kathleen Sullivan, who's an MK Ultra survivor, who wrote a book called Unshackled, The Life of an MK Ultra Survivor. And another book is by Carol Rutz, and it's called A Nation Betrayed. And, you know, the book is just full of just really solid documentation. And she talks about the experiments that she went through as a child. So yeah, I think it sort of like evolved and took a sort of a shape of its own. But I believe this stuff actually is still going on, but it's probably not through the conventional means of, let's say, drugs, hypnosis, electroshock. I believe today through the utilization of what they call directed energy weapons, it's a lot easier to program an individual.
I want to touch on that in a second, but first, why with people like Kathleen and these others who have come out, why did the training, let's say, not take? How were they able to break free of the mind control, or how do you know that they themselves weren't basically subject to the delusion or the paranoia that may have been triggered by something happening to them when they were young, basically escalating into into a fantasy? I mean, how were they able to break free in the first place?
My belief, as well as several others, basically feel that the programmers, these people who do these heinous acts and think that they can, change the world through mind control, I believe that they're just so full of pride they don't take into consideration the human spirit. And so that's one common denominator that I have seen with some of these survivors that I've talked to, and some of the information that I've read is that they've just, they don't want the controllers to get to the best of them, and they're fighters. And so it's just something that's really hard to put into words. But basically, I just feel that the human spirit can overcome almost anything.
Yeah, it's an important point, obviously, that is not dealt with within a lot of the medical establishment, obviously, and the establishment of psychology and whatnot. They don't like to appreciate, for example, the spiritual nature of reality, of the soul, and how multidimensional factors can play into what they would prefer to look at as a materialistic, three-dimensional body and brain structure. So when it comes to the EM concept, take us through that a little bit. Is that what we're talking about when we talk about targeted individuals, for example?
Right. Well, actually, TI, or targeted individuals, is a CIA term. I believe it was found in some documentation even back in the 60s. And so essentially what a TI, or targeted individual, is a person who is to be discredited or disabled by whatever means necessary. And so that can be done through what's known as gang stalking or group stalking, where maybe a couple of people, break into their house or their apartment and maybe just change a few things, like maybe take a shirt or take a beer out of the refrigerator, just things that are really subtle. But after a while, that stuff starts escalating. It can add up to where people are thinking, what the hell's going on? Am I losing my mind?
Paranoia. It becomes contagious.
There you go. So that's one aspect of a targeted individual. And the other one, it has to do with, again, the use of directed energy weapons. And a lot of that experimentation was first developed at Sandia Labs and Los Alamos National Laboratories, some of it under the direction of John Alexander, who's now retired and is on, I believe, the UFO circuit. And I've tried to pin him down on this stuff, but he's just really not willing to talk about it.
We tried him on Conspiracy Theory, if you recall, the Jesse Ventura's show. He wasn't on the TI episode, but he was on a different one, and so we were all there to interview him, and we saw how icy he is. It's quite difficult to get anything out of him.
Right. So it's just very interesting how he sort of changed his focus from the so-called non-lethal, non-ionizing weapons to sort of this UFO alien type stuff, now that he's an expert in that. So I just find it pretty intriguing.
Well, he likes to discredit it too, though. That seems to be his MO seems to be discrediting anything to do with actual UFO sightings. He doesn't seem to be. He doesn't want to really acknowledge that there's anything out there.
Yeah, it's interesting. And even when I met with him last year at the International UFO Congress Conference in Scottsdale, Arizona, I brought up voice to skull technology, which is also used for to make people feel like they're hearing voices, essentially. And so I brought up that technology, and he looked at me, and kind of rolled his eyes back, and he's going, "Yeah, isn't it a shame that people hear voices, but they're just crazy?"
Very cynical,
so
cynical of him. Whereas we've
Yeah.
seen it in the conspiracy theory episode with Jesse and that was I think season 2, when
Right.
they demonstrated the voice to skull technology, and that was just demonstrable.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, this stuff can be proven. There's actual patents that people can find on the internet to substantiate that this type of technology actually exists. And that's just one aspect of, their arsenal. It's also referred to as political control technology. And a lot of these TIs, they, for the most part, they do fit a profile. Some are referred to as dissidents, some are political activists, and just basically people that kind of go against the grain. Even people that post stuff on the internet or on Facebook that are talking against the government or against other nations. And one example is I had a friend in Los Angeles, this woman who was pro-Palestinian, and her husband was from the Middle East, and so she was talking about the atrocities perpetrated by Israel against the Palestinians, and she was getting all kinds of trolls attacking her left and right, and her Facebook would just shut down constantly. And then all of a sudden she started feeling this sort of like this electrical sensation on her skin, and she had these really severe headaches, and she went to the doctor, and the doctor felt that she was developing electrical sensitivity. So, I mean, that's just one story, but all you have to do is really just piss off one or two people, and it doesn't necessarily even have to be the government per se, because this technology is actually in the hands of private citizens.
Right. Well, that's what I was going to get at, as far as how do people not fall into paranoia. I think that's probably something that we don't want to encourage, is people to be afraid and say, well, I don't want to, this is why I don't speak out. This is why I don't speak my mind, because they're out to get us, and they're going to find ways of targeting me or harassing me or torturing me if I don't toe the line. So what is it that how are there ways of redressing the fear, let's say, of our government that's gone haywire, basically, that's become out of control in its power?
Right. Well, I mean, a lot of times people will ask me, like, man, you know so much about this kind of stuff, and you talk to all these survivors of mind control and all these TIs, and, aren't you afraid for your life? And I just tell them no. I mean, I believe it really starts within and how we feel about ourselves. We have a certain amount of control, over our thoughts. But for the most part, I just believe that there's powers in the universe that basically watch over us, myself, and I just don't have that kind of fear. There have been instances where I'd wake up and all of a sudden say, like, what the hell am I doing? Why am I into this stuff? But for the most part, I think I just feel compelled to disseminate this kind of information. And I would say my forte is really networking with people and trying to help people the best I can. So it's a really difficult question to answer in terms of, ways to overcome fear or paranoia. But I really think it starts deep within our soul. And we have to be very introspective as to what we're doing and not be reckless too. And I think we need to be careful as far as what's our real agenda? Why are we doing this? And so I try not to do this for ego or for pride or anything, but I truly want to help other people.
Mm-hmm.
So that's my motivation.
Sure, because there are plenty of cults that do pop up around some conspiracy theorists or guru types, basically, who create a cult of personality and do fall into that ego trap, even as they proclaim to be fighting against the system. They create a system around themselves. But my question would be then, has there been any legal forms of redress for victims of MK Ultra or Monarch? Have you seen any people actually try to go to court or try to file for a Freedom of Information Act to get more information publicly available about what kind of black programs are going on?
Yes. As a matter of fact, in 1995, I believe, there was a presidential committee hearing that was headed by a psychiatrist from New Orleans. Her name was Valerie Wolf. And so she had a panel of MK Ultra survivors give their testimony about some of the human experimentation that they went through. And it was quite compelling, quite riveting. And even President Clinton said, we're definitely going to get down to the bottom of this, and justice will be served. Of course.
Famous last words from any president, right? As soon as a president says that they're going to do something, you can pretty much don't hold your breath.
Right. But I mean, you can see this, I believe the testimony, I think it was like a 2 or 3 day testimony, and there were probably about 6 to 7 survivors of MK Ultra. I believe all of them were women, and a lot of them talked about the same thing, and I think quite a few of them were quite credible in their testimony. They were talking about, again, like either being at a military installation or at a hospital and remember things when they were younger, and all these like German doctors, hearing these doctors speak in German, and later they concluded that these were actually probably Project Paperclip doctors that came, through South America into the United States right after 1945 and 46. So basically, a lot of this MK Ultra stuff, a lot of the experiments were initially done in concentration camps, like at Dachau and Auschwitz during World War II. And so we happened to get quite a few of these doctors and scientists into the United States to kind of help solidify these mind control programs, as well as programs involving chemical, biological warfare. And of course, I think most people know that the CIA was actually created by Reinhard Gehlen, who was the chief intelligence officer of Hitler. So,
how do you mean created by? I mean, obviously, the CIA was created by the National Security Act in 47, and then basically it turned over OSS. A lot of the OSS officers and guys like Dulles obviously had helped to steer it and create the CIA. But how was Gehlen involved?
Well, who created the National Security Act? And so basically, Alan Dulles was the front man, but the real mastermind. And there's several books that talk about Reinhard Gehlen's influence in helping to really form the CIA. Before that it was the OSS, but Gehlen actually came into the country before the end of World War II and met with President Truman and William Donovan, and that's where it pretty much started. And so basically, prior to the CIA, and I believe it was 46, it was the CIG, then a year after it became the CIA, and then in 1947, Reinhard Gehlen is the one who actually put together the National Security Act. So Alan Dulles, I believe there's a book called Virtual Government by Alex Constantine, and there's a couple of other books talking about Gehlen's influence on, both intelligence and propaganda in the 1950s, how he really created the Red Scare or the communist threat during that time. Right.
Obviously to play up the need for the national security state, which we've never given up since 47. In terms of the Nazi, obviously you mentioned in your article, subtitle Project Monarch was Nazi mind control. So how much of this MK Ultra program was derived from Nazi experiments in concentration camps? I mean, personally, I've always wondered if MK doesn't stand for mind control in the German spelling of it, mind control ultra, right? But how much of the mind control MK Ultra was derived from the concentration camps?
It's really hard to say, because the reality is that you only find about 20%, could be even less, of the original documentation from MK Ultra through the Freedom of Information Act. I believe John Mark, the journalist who wrote about MK Ultra experiments back in the late 70s, right after the church hearings, came to that realization. So it's really hard to ascertain exactly how much of those Nazi experiments were transferred over in the United States, but there's a lot of testimony, again, by survivors who remember hearing these German doctors, and there's even talk that Joseph Mengele came into the United States during that time. And I actually had a talk with a guy who was in the DIA, who I had asked, about Joseph Mengele, his involvement in, mind control, just kind of picking his brain. And he looked at me and he said, "How did you know about that?" And basically, it was just a guess. I didn't say that, but I've had talks with different people in the intelligence community who have hinted, they couldn't say because of their clearance, but they know that Joseph Mengele was in the United States, not just some hermit running around in South America, trying to run away from, I guess, or like the various Jewish elements that were trying to find him. But so anyway, it's just very intriguing about Mengele, because there's so many spurious stories that go all over the place from him being both in the United States and in Canada.
Right. But you don't think ultimately more Freedom of Information Act sort of disclosures will come out regarding MK Ultra and various sub-projects?
I don't think so. If they will come out, I don't think it's going to be for years and years. I mean, that's how it usually works. We just don't really hear about these type of things. It's just sort of a very gradual process, because we're just not ready. It's too much of a shock for society. And now we're at that stage where there's so much mind control going on, both on a micro and macro scale. And now with the advent, I think you talked to Ilana Freeland in a previous show, and she's writing a book about the whole electromagnetic grid and how the whole planet is basically subjected to a form of electronic mind control.
Yeah, that's obviously the main concern is, what does mind control even mean? I mean, it's obviously a struggle to figure out at what point we are sovereign over our own minds. We know that we go through various forms of mind control from the point of our birth, socialization into society, the way that we acclimate to culture, television, and all these forms of programming that are played to us. So mind control, as you said, is pervasive now. And it's very interesting to know at what level this is controlled, at what level it's directed, and by whom. Obviously, there's been talk of the Illuminati, which is a different element beyond and above and beyond any government, let's say. Mm-hmm. What do you make of the testimony of people like Arizona Wilder, who claimed to have been a priestess of the Illuminati, who had been raised in a way that seemed ritualistic and similar to some of the mind control and Monarch experiments on children herself, and then obviously growing up into what she considered to be this cult that derived from elite control and basically was beyond any single government control.
Right. I remember talking to her at the Conspiracy Con, I believe it was back in 2006, and like a lot of survivors who talk about Illuminati slash Rothschild mind control programming, there are some elements of truth to what they're saying, but I think a lot of them, unfortunately, are still programmed, and a lot are still sort of like spewing out disinformation, which includes probably embellishment or exaggeration of certain facts. So it just seems like quite a few survivors sort of fit that mold, and that's what I sort of gathered from Arizona. And I don't know if she's really even talking about this stuff anymore.
Yeah, it's so unfortunate that we only have most of the time witness testimony and really we have to take people at their word as opposed to having any kind of clear documentation and evidence from which I don't even know if it exists anymore. As we know with MK Ultra, so many documents were shredded that
Yes.
we don't know at what point these things were turned over to private corporations and privatized and turned over to black projects. So they're basically beyond even the control or oversight of government at this point.
Oh, I totally agree with you there. There's a case in point where back around 1997, when I was living in Olympia, Washington, an MK Ultra survivor from Nebraska contacted me and asked if my wife and I could safe house this woman who was running away from the mob. And so we said, well, give us some more information. She said she's a presidential model and she's running away from the Tantinis, who basically were running the Las Vegas mob, and she was being handled by Daniel Tantini. That was her handler. And the mob was very much into this type of MK Ultra type programming. And I guess they had a deal with the government where they could sort of like timeshare these individuals because, you know, they were multifaceted. They could do a number of things. They could do drug running, prostitution, assassinations. So my wife and I actually helped this one woman who Kathy Phillips even said, told her, I heard her on the phone, that, you know, you're a lot higher than I am in regard to, you know, what she was valuable for. And so we helped this woman, and it was only supposed to be for about 2 weeks, and it turned out to be 2 months. But it was just such a crazy time because we had all this surveillance around our house, cars parked in front, the dreaded black helicopters going over our house, hovering over to the house, so our house was shaking, and actual spotlights sometimes even coming onto our house. Basically, we're just saying that, you know, we're here, we know you're in there. And so it was just a really crazy time. And this woman was allegedly involved in an assassination of Luis Donaldo Colosio, who was the presidential candidate of Mexico in 1994. And she had no memory the day before, the day of, the day after. But she has a lot of facts about what happened. And she has no idea why she has all this information stored in her head. And that's another common characteristic with some of these MK Ultra trauma-based mind control survivors, is they just have so much detailed information about certain people that might be like hits or targets. So I mean, that stuff just doesn't fall out of the sky. And I was actually able to do some background checking into some of the stuff she was talking about, and it all came out crystal clear. It was there was a direct link to what she was saying. Yeah, it's an interesting story. Where can people find out more about you and obviously your articles? And that's paranoiamagazine.com. What's the website? Yeah, people can go to paranoiamagazine.com. And I'm also starting a new website called The Conspirazone. And but people can just go to paranoiamagazine.com for now. And I'll actually be starting a conspiracy store here in Portland. I had one down in San Diego, but that'll probably be coming up sometime in September.
Very cool. Well, it was a pleasure having you on and speaking with you about the bit of the history of MK Ultra and Monarch, and I hope to hear more from you in the future.
Okay, thanks a lot, Sean. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Ron.
You're welcome.
Well, folks, it may be that if you're not paranoid, you don't have a clue, but I think it's more likely that there is nothing to fear but fear itself, which is to say, yes, there are many strange things and horrible things happening in our world that we need to be aware of. At the same time, do not panic. Do not be afraid of these forces because, as Ron talked about, there are spiritual factors involved, and ultimately, this might be a battle not only for your mind, but for your soul. This is Sean Stone signing off.